Hello and welcome to this video on aggregate demand. In this video, we're going to look at what is meant by aggregate demand, the components of aggregate demand, and finally look at distinguishing between a movement along the aggregate demand curve and a shift in the aggregate demand curve. Okay, let's get started with what we mean by aggregate demand. If we break these two words down, demand first of all, how would we describe demand? Well, it's the willingness within the economy for people to buy things. Secondly, how would we go about describing the word aggregate? Well, if you think of the word aggregate, perhaps maybe in a football match, an aggregate score is the score across all legs of the match. It is the total final score added together. So if we relate that now to our economy, aggregate demand is the total level of planned expenditure on goods and services produced within a country. So the key here is it's the amount that businesses and households are willing or planning to spend. Noting that GDP is the actual value of what is spent, whereas aggregate demand is the plans or the intention of how much people and firms are going to spend. Changes in aggregate demand are important so that we can understand the fluctuations in the business cycle, so recession and recovery, booms and slowdowns. So let's now look at the components. What makes up the level of spending in an economy? Well, we're going to draw on these ideas that we had previously about the consumption of goods and services, injections and withdrawals, and look at the components of aggregate demand in a bit more detail. So the components of aggregate demand are, well, first of all, household spending on goods and services. And we denote that as C, consumption. Secondly, we have investment. So investment in machinery and tools and factories and spending by businesses, for example, on new equipment, that would count as investment. Gross fixed capital investment is something we'll come on to in another video. Then we have the value of any money the business has put into stocks that they can then go on to sell. So that's another I. Then we have government spending, providing things like public services, which we call G. And then another injection is the value of exports. So that is a level of demand within our economy, comes from exports, which we label as X for exports. And then finally, we subtract off any imports. So we minus off imports, which we use as M for imports. So the level of aggregate demand in our economy will be determined by household consumption plus investment plus government spending plus what we call the balance of trade. So the value of exports, that is money coming in, subtract the value of imports as that is money going out. So these four combined things added together give us the total level of aggregate demand in the economy. So it's important that we remember this formula: consumption plus investment plus government spending plus the balance of trade. And if you look at these letters very quickly and you say them quickly, SIGISM, a good way, or a way in which I might remember this, it's not particularly healthy, is to think, I drag on a cigarette, and then a lot of smokers go, So SIGGIES, and C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Not very healthy, I grant you, but it's a good way to remember it. Now, most commonly, aggregate demand is represented through a curve, a diagram. And the aggregate demand curve shows us the amount of goods and services in the whole economy that are demanded in relation to the current price level. So we're linking back to what we studied in terms of inflation. So if we have a look at the aggregate demand curve, what we're trying to show here is the relationship in terms of demand between the price level on this axis, so what is the current price level, and at any given price level, what is going to be the demand for goods and services across our economy in aggregate. And the demand curve typically looks like this. The general relationship is that as the price level increases, the demand or the amount of goods and services that people wish to buy decreases. So here we can read off the chart and see at any given price level in the economy, how much would be the level of demand. Now, if the price level was to rise or fall, this might change the amount of demand within the economy. So for example, a rise in the price level, if there is inflation, this will cause a contraction of aggregate demand. We can see that as the price level rises, demand, the amount of goods and services that will be demanded across the whole economy will decrease. Similarly, as the price level falls, there'll be an expansion in demand. The amount of goods and services that people demand across the economy would increase. So changes in the price level cause movements along our aggregate demand curve. And that's an important rule to note down. So why does the aggregate demand curve slope downwards? It's not quite as simple as saying, well, if prices are high, people don't buy as much, because we're not looking here at price and quantity. We're looking at the price level across the economy, and we're looking at real GDP, the total value of goods and services across the economy as well. So it's a little bit more complex, the reason why it is downward sloping. And there are three main reasons. The first reason is as the price level rises, when price level is high, the real value of income, so your income adjusted for inflation, will be lower. What your money can buy, the real value of your income will fall. And if the real value of your income falls, then consumers are less able to buy what they want or need. They are less able to buy. So as inflation rises, real incomes are falling, so people are able to buy less and less goods. The second reason is that if the price level is rising in a particular country, it could make foreign produced goods and services appear cheaper and domestically goods produced within that country appear more expensive. So we'd expect to see a fall in exports from that country and a rise in imports. And again, if price level is rising, then we'd expect fewer and fewer exports, and that is falling demand within our economy, and more imports. Again, that's causing falling AD, so it shifts. It is this slope. The last one is if the price level rises, this causes inflation, and often the government will react by increasing interest rates. And if interest rates go up, this decreases consumer and business demand because they have less disposable income. So again, as inflation rises, price level rises, interest rates rise, which reduces spending, people's willingness to spend within the economy. So this is why we have this downward slope, why it follows this pattern. This explains the relationship here between the price level and real GDP. Okay, so any changes in price level cause a movement along the aggregate demand curve. But sometimes there will be changes in aggregate demand that weren't caused by a change in the price level. And when this happens, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift. It's going to move in total. So again, we have our aggregate demand curve is the relationship between price level and real GDP in terms of demand across businesses and households. And if we start here with our first aggregate demand curve, if there is an increase in demand in the economy and it's not linked to price, what we are saying is that at any given price level, people will be willing to purchase more. So here there's been an increase in demand in the economy. It's not been caused by price. So even at this price level, people will be willing to buy more. And so we would shift the demand curve. So if there's any cause of an increase in demand in the economy that's not to do with a change in prices, we're going to see a shift. And a shift out means potentially higher national output, greater real GDP, and a shift in would mean potentially lower national output or GDP. Okay, so let's make sure we've got these down in our notes. The difference between a movement along caused by a change in the price level and a shift caused by something else. But what else, you might say? So let's look at some shifts, some causes of shifts in the aggregate demand curve. What would change the level of demand in the economy, but it's not something that is not the price level? So these might be some ideas. to do with the currency or to do with government spending or interest rates and so on. Let's go through these in turn and see how they're going to affect AD. So on the left-hand side, we've got some reasons why aggregate demand might fall. Now, the first reason might be a stronger currency. And if we think about what component aggregate demand that's going to affect, that is going to affect our balance of trade. Spiced, a stronger pound is going to make imports cheaper, exports dearer. So if imports are cheaper, we're going to see more imports, which is a negative component in aggregate demand, and less exports, which is a positive component. So overall, the impact is going to be negative. So that would shift AD to the left. A cut in government spending. Well, that is going to reduce government spending as a component of demand. If that's their policy to cut government spending, that's going to shift AD to the left. Higher interest rates maybe would cause less investment by firms because the cost of borrowing is increased. Less investment is going to cause a shift to the left in terms of AD. And finally, if households feel wealthier, maybe house prices have decreased, then if households feel less wealthy, they're not going to plan to spend as much. There's going to be a decrease in consumption that would cause aggregate demand to shift to the left. On the flip side, some increases. If we turn these ones around, a weaker currency is going to cause us to export more, import less. So that'll be a positive impact in terms of aggregate demand, shift it to the right. Cuts in tax would be a smaller withdrawal from the economy, maybe leading to a net greater effect of government spending. Increases in house prices, again, would cause an increase in consumption in our economy as people feel wealthier. And lastly, an expansion of the supply of credit, making it easier to borrow, and lower interest rates might cause more investment and shift AD to the right. So there are a number of causes of shifts in the AD curve that we should be aware of and the components that they're affecting. Key causes of shifts tend to be the following. So the first of all, if the Bank of England or the government were to change any interest rates or the supply of money and credit, or were to change the value of a country's exchange rate, all of these would be under the bracket of monetary policy. If the government or the Bank of England change any of these, this is called monetary policy. And as we just discussed, these could have an impact on AD. If the government were to change their planned government spending or tax rates, we call this fiscal policy, and again that would have an impact on the level of aggregate demand. So changes in tax or the changes in the amount the government borrows and spends would have an impact. And finally, business and consumer confidence is very important because this affects the level of planned investment in the economy and also how much retail spending, how much spending there is done by households. Sometimes there are unexpected events that cause sudden changes in demand, output and employment, and we call these, you often hear these described as being shocks to the economy. So an event such as the global financial crisis, which caused a fall in the supply of credit available to business households, made it harder for business households to borrow, saw a big fall in consumption and investment, a sudden reduction in consumption and investment, causing a fall in national output. A slump in the housing market might have the same effect in terms of consumption. A recession in a trading partner, another country that buys a lot of your exports, again might have a sudden impact on the level of exports and so cause a reduction in aggregate demand. So we describe a sudden large impact on aggregate demand, a shock. Okay, so in this video we've looked at what is meant by aggregate demand, we looked at the components of aggregate demand, and then the important distinction between a movement along the aggregate demand curve caused by a change in the price level and a shift in the aggregate demand curve which would be caused by other events within the economy. That's it. Thank you very much.